We are going to take a look at a couple of more materials now, and some of the input nodes we can use within the function editor to control them a little bit more. I'm going to start out by loading in a sphere, and we could just go into the material editor, and then we're going to go into our function editor. And first I just want to clear out these default nodes that we have connected. So we can just click on them and select delete. And then we're just going to click OK and close out of that. I'm going to change this to a mixed material now. And what we're going to be taking a look at is controlling our distribution between two different materials by using a couple of different input nodes to create a lot of different types of effects. So we need two different types of materials first that we want to mix together, and the easiest way to really show this is to have two different colors. We'll just use some solid colors. So I'm going to load in a color map and select red under solid colors. And then if we go to our first material, we can load in another color map, and we're going to select blue, because those are pretty far apart from each other on the color spectrum, and they'll show up pretty well. And now we want to go to our main material. And what we can do is just compress that if you want, so you can see which is our main material. And under distribution of materials 1 and 2, what we have our blue and our red, I'm going to right mouse click and go to edit function. And now we have a distribution output node, and this is going to determine how we mix these materials together. Also keep in mind when we're working on something like this with distribution, we do not see a preview of the material with our output observer. But what we can do is if we close out or move our material editor, and I'll just go ahead and click OK, move our material editor over, we'll be able to take a look at the main camera preview, and then we can see exactly what we're working on. One quick and easy connection is being able to just attach our distribution directly to slope. And if we take a look at the update in our preview, we can see we have the red on the top and the blue on the bottom. We can also control that with the altitude as well. So if we go back into our function editor, we could connect that, change that link to go to altitude. And that's going to work similarly in this specific method, although we don't see that nice little gradient blend that we had before between these two materials. And we can always use a filter to modify that if we wanted to change that overall value. Same thing with the slope. But let's disconnect this right now, and we're going to take a look at adding in some of the input nodes that aren't automatically added. So we can right mouse click, go to add input node, and now you can see we have a whole bunch of different options. A lot of these are already available on the top, which we can see position, normal, slope, altitude, orientation. But if we move down a little bit lower, we can see some new options that are extremely helpful. And we're going to start with using the angle of incidence. And this is going to be based on just the overall direction of our surface and where it's facing the camera, along with, since the fact that we're using a sphere, we have that nice rounded edge. Now right now, we're not really going to see anything. If we take a look at our preview, we really only see the one material, and that's because we haven't added any filters or anything to modify exactly how we want to adjust that instance. So we're going to go back into the material editor again, and I'm going to move that off to the side just so we can see a preview. And if we take a look at the grayscale function and just kind of the preview of the overall input node, we can see how we want to control that. So we can use a couple of different filters for this. And technically you could actually use all of the filters. If we change that to a sine wave, we can start to see a little blue dot showing up in the center, and how we adjust our brightness and contrast for this. We're going to see a couple of different effects based on the incidence. And because it is based on the incidence angle, no matter how we rotate around this object, it's going to look basically the same, with the exception of where the shadows are. Because this is all entirely based on that sort of overall slope of the object. And we can see as we just move around, that red dot is always going to stay in the center, and this material is going to look the same. And let's go ahead and change that filter, something a little bit different. And what we can do is select our filter, and then just change it rather than adding in anything new. We can go with just the regular filter, and that way we can set up based on some curves in our little graph here. Go ahead and turn on our curves, and I'm just going to move our top point down a little, and you can see that it's starting to bring in the black areas, which is going to be the blue part. And if we could pull that down even more, and then we start to lose some of the white areas. So let's go ahead and take a look at that. I'm going to click OK, and now we just have a very simple blend between these two materials. And since we're just using something that's blue and red right now, it doesn't look very interesting. So let's swap out these materials and make it look a little more interesting. And what we can do is just by going to our default surface, which is the main mixed material, we can load in a new material 1 and material 2. And I'm just going to load in some of the presets that come with View just by clicking on our load button. And I want to go to the glasses collection. And we can select, we'll select crystal for our material 1, which is going to be the outside. And now for material 2, I'm going to go to liquids, and we can select our default water. And now we can see that water showing up with crystal on the outside. And this gives us a really neat looking effect. Just going to move our camera over just a little. And let's go ahead and render that out and take a look. Change that to a final render. Just render that to the screen. And if you look at the ground where the caustics are, you can really see a neat looking effect where we have the different types of refraction indexes for each of these surfaces. And then if we take a look at the center of the surface itself, we can really see that water showing up. Let's go ahead and change that out a little bit more. And first thing I'm going to do is just swap these materials, and that way we're going to have the water on the outside and that crystal surface on the inside. And I'm going to change this to our blue water, and that will change it for our outside. And let's go ahead and change that glass center. I'm going to change this to the green glass, the wine bottle glass. And we'll be able to see it a little bit better. And go ahead and render that out. And we can see those nice caustics on the bottom with our transparency and the shadows that we have. And then the material itself looks really cool. And we can modify that even more using different filters. We could change this to the map filter. And by changing our lower and upper values, we can get some different sorts of effects, depending on how we have our contrast. Right now it's going to give us a little bit of a blue outline on the outside, and then the inside is going to be very green. And then of course we can always connect these different parameters where we have our lower, upper for both the input and output range, and we can control those with other functions. So I could add in a noise node and connect our lower value for our input range. And right now that's not going to show up too much, so we would need to modify a couple of different settings, mainly using a new filter if needed. Or we could even apply a new filter to that. We'll change that to the sine wave. We'll increase our brightness and change our contrast options. And now we can see something a little more varied. Let's go ahead and just render that. And now we can see those nice variations that we have caused by that noise node that we used. And if we use a fractal node, we'll have a little bit more detail between our blending. But let's go ahead and change out these objects, and we're going to take a look at another input node that we can use. And in this case is for creating sort of a foamy seashore. And I'm going to load in just a standard terrain. And we can apply a surface to this. We're going to go into our material layers. Actually, we'll go up to landscapes. And I'm going to select our rocks and plants. And I'm going to make this a little bit larger, just by using that size gizmo. And now I want to add in our water. So we could just use an infinite plane for water, change to our move gizmo, and I'm just going to move this up a little bit higher. And now we can still see that transparency underneath, where we can see the overall square shape of that terrain. So we could either edit the material itself or just make our terrain a little larger. So I'm going to increase the size of our terrain, and then if we need to, we can also change our material. Select our water, move that up a little bit higher, go back into our material editor now for our water, and we're going to go to the transparency tab. And now under the fading out, we can make it a little bit murkier, which is going to give us the appearance that it's a little bit larger scale water, and we won't see as much transparency, and we won't see the bottom square shape that we have caused by that terrain. But what we want to do is just create a little bit of a white rim around the edge of our terrain. And now there's different ways of doing this. One thing we could do is go into the terrain material, and if we added a new layer, we could make just a white layer that only affects the altitude range of that shoreline. But there's a much cooler way, and something that's going to affect the water itself and not the terrain material. So we can open up the material for our terrain. I'm going to change this to a mixed material. I want to swap these so that we have our new material under material 1, and material 2 is going to be our water. Right now it's not currently updating, so we can close that out. And we can see, although we know material 2 is our default water, it's currently not showing up the correct preview. So let's just go back to material 1. I'm going to select just our layer for that, and I'm going to edit our color map. Go to our first point and first key color, and we can delete it because we just want to be working with white. And if you take a look at our surface, right now it's just blending these two together, where we have our water along with this white surface on top. If we go to our main material for distribution, this is what we're going to be using to control where we want the placement of this water. And we're going to be using the reference of our terrain in order to control that. So we can go to Edit Material, edit our function, and I'm going to add in a new input node, and we're going to be using distance to object below. And in this case, that is our terrain. Of course, that will work with any object that is going to be below this surface. So we can connect our distribution directly to that input node. And if we close it out right now and take a look, we're really not going to see anything showing up. So what we need to do is create a filter in between those connections in order to control the overall value. There's a couple of different filters we can use for this. Of course, it really depends on the size of the object and what it is you're working with. I'm going to go back to that map filter we were just using. This one seems to work pretty well. And for these values, what I want to do is take our lower value of our output range and bring that all the way down to -1. And then for our upper value in the input range, I'm going to increase that all the way to 10. If we take a look at the preview, we can start to see just that little bit of a shoreline showing up and the nice foamy waves towards the end. And now what we can do is adjust our lower value of the input range to pretty much determine how large we want that area to be. So as we increase that value, we'll start to see that shoreline of those foam waves just start to increase a little bit more. And right now we're just seeing a white surface, so we'll need to make a few changes in order to make it look more realistic. But I'll stick with that right now, just a little over 7. We can click OK. And now what we want to use is our smooth blending strip in order to fade that out a little bit more, because right now it's a very harsh contrast and a very harsh rim on the edge there. And we can take a look at that just by zooming in, and I can just do a quick render. So if we take a look, we can see very harsh edges, and what we need to do is just kind of smooth that out. So we'll just use our smooth blending strip and just pull the slider over. And the more we bring that out, the more smoothing we're going to see along that edge. Bring that up to 100. And then we could also go through some of the different types of blending modes too. Right now we're on a simple blend. If we go to cover, and we switch that over, we're going to notice a much more reduced color from our original material. We could go to a full blend with linear bumps or cubic bumps, and then we can blend the color and lighting only. And if you take a look at that, we're going to see almost the entire white surface, and it doesn't really look right. So go back to simple blend, increase that to a rather high amount. And now it's not a very white surface. At least it doesn't shine as much as it normally would. So what we can do is go to the Effects tab for that white foam and increase the luminous or the ambient setting. And I'm just going to increase our ambient, and that'll brighten it up a little bit. I'm also going to go back into the function for our distribution and just adjust that map a little bit more and decrease that lower value for our input range. And that'll tone down the effect a little bit more, make it look a little bit better. We'll take a look at a render for that. And now we can see that overall effect, and it looks really good. One thing I want to do is take the bump map from our water and paste it onto the bump map for our foam, and that way that'll match up, and we could also animate those two together. Along the shoreline itself, we can see it's extremely sharp cutoff. So what we could also do is that other method I was talking about before, where we add another layer onto our terrain, and then just change the altitude range to match just the edge of the shore, and that will help that overall look. And I could show you that really quick. Just open up the material for our terrain. We're going to add a new layer, and that's going to bring up the chooser, and we can stick with the default, change that color map so that it is white. And if we go over to the environment tab, we can see we have an altitude range. So all we would need to do is adjust this altitude range to match up with where our shoreline is. And then we can use the fuzziness options for top and bottom to blend that a little bit more into our terrain. And if we change this to absolute or by material, we'll have a little bit of different amounts of control. I'm going to increase the fuzziness for the top to kind of blend that into our terrain a little bit better. But we'll start to lose that sharp edge that's really kind of taking over the surface. And if we switch this to the absolute, then we're going to get some real values where we can adjust it based on meters. And that way, if you want to be more specific about exactly where you want that placement to be, then you can match that up. So that's a really cool way to use that. Another cool thing about this input node is if we move our terrain down, we can see the shoreline will still show up. Because that's all based on our object below, and since it's on the water material, we don't have to worry about resizing or positioning our terrain differently. The only thing we'd really have to do is change the size of the foam. But of course this will work with other objects as well. We can remove our terrain from the scene, add in a sphere, and now we can see the sphere has the same sort of an effect. If we zoom into that a little bit closer, you can see that around the edge. If we move that down, we just start to see it poking up a little bit on the surface. So that's a really cool way we can use that specific input node.